Hey folks, Michael Mann with Michael Mann Security Services, and welcome to Predatory Violence Statistics for Prevention for Houses of Worship. Hey, before we get started into this, we're going to get into some terms and acronyms for you guys to understand and remember before I get into this quick presentation. So when we say adversary, adversary is the bad guy, the person we're trying to keep out of our house of worship or keep away. Asset is anything that has a positive value to your house of worship, your church, and most of the time in this case, we're talking about the people, the congregation, the visitors, the staff, etc. Behavior threat detection, as you know, is the process that we teach that uses an understanding of your operational environment and basic physical security principles and strategies to actually see predatory violence early or potential predatory violence or warning signs or indicators. And through a simple process of identification and validation, stopping or preventing that violence from occurring at your house of worship. Planning in the context for this presentation is when the adversary or an active assailant goes through the process of being successful in their attack. And that is everything from selecting the target to conducting remote hostile surveillance, on-site hostile surveillance, etc. Predatory violence, or what some people call intentional violence, is that premeditated, planned act of actually conducting the attack. And the purpose of predatory violence is to do nothing more than to destroy or kill those targets. Preparation is when the adversary actually goes and procures the equipment and trains for that attack. So that is preparation. PSP is just an acronym for your physical security plan. So it's just a document that outlines everything that you guys are doing from a physical security standpoint. These are important. So if you've got some sort of succession plan where somebody's going to step off, especially in leadership, somebody else can come back in, then you've got a document that says exactly what your standards are. It's very important when we have a physical security program. Response are the actions taken to neutralize a threat. And in prevention, that is really the behavior threat detection process, suspicious activity reporting, and your planning. Risk is your church's exposure to some kind of hazard. And in this case, what we're talking about is predatory violence or those active assailants or other acts of violence that could at some point compromise the assets. And vulnerability, by definition, is like a weakness in a physical protection system. Normally, the easiest way to remember that is something that you are not doing in your program. Okay? All right, so you guys have heard this before. We start talking about our threat spectrum in churches. Remember, when we start talking about predatory violence, we talk about active assailants in churches. After the attack, what we find out at these locations is the threats and vulnerabilities, the majority of the time, were not understood, very specifically the threat. So they didn't understand that that person or those persons were a threat. And so where some sort of an indication, circumstance, or event occurred, and they did not identify that as a threat, and their security weaknesses or their vulnerabilities were unknown. Okay, a lot of times that comes into was at least a security survey conducted. I always suggest assessments. There's a difference between a survey and assessment, but either one is where somebody comes in, whether it's a survey assessment, comes in and they're going to do an examination of what you were doing and then make some sort of suggestions based on best practices, right? So the assessment is a more of an analysis, a very detailed analysis. The survey just comes in and does a quick examination. Both or one of the other are required to identify at a minimum what those vulnerabilities are. We also understand, especially in houses of worship, the majority of the time, these adversaries were unchallenged, and access to that protected space where the shooting occurred was just unprotected. Warning signs, they were not detected, or at least they were not managed. If something was detected, maybe they didn't know what it was and they didn't know how to manage those warning signs or those threats. Obviously, law enforcement response is always delayed. And then security response, it was very responsive, not preventative. Again, it kind of goes back to the threats were not identified. They were unchallenged. Even if there were warning signs there, they didn't exactly know what they were. And so this was a very responsive act. It was not preventative, right? So the attack still occurred. Now, here's some, I like statistics. The FBI puts out some good stuff. You have to go into the studies and you have to look and do your own research Number one, to validate that this is going to be helpful for what it is that you're doing or why you need the information. And number two, they're not always 100% correct. There's some things in the reports that you have to kind of sift through and you may not use. But this is a really good study that I like to talk about in our behavior threat detection that the FBI put out, or the U.S. U.S. Department of Justice put out 2018. And here's what this study identified and validated about predatory violence or active assailants. And it was in general, it just didn't focus on houses of worship. It picked out, I think there were 63 active assailant events and adversaries that they looked at, which included assailants from houses of worship. But the study identified pre-attack behaviors. It identifies some key findings, which we're going to talk about in a minute. And these are all important, these key findings that we're going to talk about and these identification of these behaviors for your planning and prevention. Very specifically, developing your physical security plan for your church, understanding what your potential threats are, and preventing predatory violence. So I like going in to look at studies, to look at statistics, because all of these things help build a case, again, for your physical security plan, for understanding what it is you're trying to protect the church against, and the most important thing, preventing that violence from occurring at your house of worship. Now, here's some of the key findings, and I'm going to talk about some things here at the end that, again, I'm not going to say it's a vulnerability or weakness, but some things to consider when you read this report, because again, it's not, I don't think it's 100%, right? So, so most of it was awesome, it was great. So some key findings: adversaries could not be identified prior to attacking based on demographics alone. So, in security, I will tell you, and you guys can look at my background. I've got military, very extensive law enforcement to include, I am an instructor in criminal justice at a major college. I've been involved in law enforcement operations for many years and security operations for more. I would just to remind you, to tell you, when it comes to police versus security, when police officers look for threats, a lot of times they profile because they have information about specific threats, and profiling in law enforcement can at times, depending on the operational environment, what they're looking for, profiling, can be helpful. And that's been shown in the past, especially when you start looking at drug activity and fighting in the war on drugs. We start looking at when that kicked off in the late 80s, and they still use profiling today to fight the drug war. But in security, when we're looking at prevention and we're looking at trying to stop something, we don't look at profile or demographics. We're not looking at if it's a male or female, or the color of their skin, or their sex. Sex, color of skin, the profiling piece, number one, that's sacred. God decides those things. And two, that has nothing to do with how we identify a threat when we start talking about predatory violence. And this report very specifically identifies that. Adversaries could not be identified prior to the attack based on demographics alone. So signature, behavior threat detection is about signature. It is about behavior, not profiling. So that's very important when it comes to preventing an attack, especially when it comes to the security industry or when we start talking about your physical security plan. This is about behavior. This takes very specific or requires specific security, not law enforcement related training. Adversaries always take time to plan and prepare for the attack. The adversaries in this study took the time to prepare and plan for the attacks, and that is for any attack. This goes back to Genesis 4, after the fall. Guys, we live in a Genesis 3:15 world. It is violent. It is very undesirable, and we see this, the start of this in Genesis 4, when we see the first act of predatory violence, when Cain kills his brother Abel. Nothing has changed. On average, adversaries displayed 4 to 5 concerning behaviors over time that were observable to others. Not only to people that the adversary that they were around, like family members or people that they see every day, but also behaviors prior to the attack. It's just that, again, going back to our threat spectrum, they just weren't identified because either the training wasn't there, the security personnel didn't know. Okay. Now, one thing that the study talks about is it gets into targeted and random. Listen, there is no such thing as a targeted attack. This is a biblical approach to security, folks. The Bible tells us in our fallen state. If you don't believe, you don't want to believe Genesis, just go into Romans. and just listen to what Paul or read what Paul has to say about us. No one is righteous, no, not one. No one seeks for God, no one understands. That is all of us. We are all fallen, we are all broken. When we talk about attacks very specifically, and these folks that we're trying to prevent from coming into our house of worship, these folks that are not influenced by the Holy Spirit, that are not restrained, understand that none of these activities from them are random. Going back to Genesis 4, biblical approach to security, all attacks are targeted or pre-planned. So that's something I don't agree with in the FBI study, but hey, we're not going to agree with everything 100%, right? So really good key findings that we can use as a strategy to understand what is required to prevent violence or these attacks in houses of worship. Now, right here in Nashville, Tennessee, in my hometown, we've got some really good case studies, some unfortunate attacks or attacks that almost occurred, where where pre-attack surveillance was identified. Number one, in March 7th, 2023, the Covenant School attack in Nashville, Tennessee. Before the Covenant attack, that adversary was very specifically identified at another target. So going through the planning process, she was going through her planning process to conduct an attack. She had two targets. In the first target, she was looking for vulnerability. She was on site conducting her hostile surveillance. It was another school. Two staff members of the school identified something outside of their pattern. So outside of, some people call it a baseline. They didn't know who she was, but they recognized that there was somebody on property walking around, looking at things that didn't belong there. They engaged with her, not knowing that she was an actual threat. And then that adversary left. She very promptly left. And then later, and not that day, but I don't know the timeline because some of the stuff has not been released. But later, I think weeks later, she actually conducted the attack at the Covenant School. So we know that there was pre-attack surveillance at one of the targets, and sure, based on this report and based on our experience in this, we're also sure she conducted that pre-attack surveillance and went through that planning process at Covenant also. But we know for sure from information available that on one of the targets, as she was going through the selection process, that pre-attack surveillance or that hostile surveillance was detected. It was not identified as pre-attack surveillance. The staff members didn't know, but we do know that engagement psychologically impacted her motivation to attack that first target. March of 2024, another school in Nashville, Tennessee, was threatened. Christ Presbyterian Academy, which has a connection to the Covenant School. Covenant is a feeder to CPA. There was some cyber threats made toward that school. That person just last week was convicted of cyber threatening and was convicted to 6 years in a federal penitentiary. This person made a threat online to the church, and then in the investigation, prior to the threat, saw this person on camera before the threat actually conducting on-site surveillance, walking around the school, not detected by the physical security folks at the school. They had to go back during the investigation, and they found out that this person had been on site actually looking around and gathering information. They went back and looked at their cameras and did actually validate that information. So one potential attack where the person threatened and then was convicted of that threat to conduct the attack, and then one, the Covenant School, where the person actually conducted an attack. So two really good case studies here in Nashville where we know that this, just to validate this report, that this planning and this preparation takes place, and it can be detected. Okay. So with all this information, what do we do? What's your next steps? Hey guys, if you haven't done it, look at a security survey or security assessment. The survey is it's an examination of what you're currently doing, and then it provides opportunities for you or some suggestions on how to improve the security. A security assessment is a very detailed analysis of your program, and then it also involves a threat assessment, a vulnerability assessment, plus suggestions for improvement. If you're looking for something quick and you're on a budget and you don't have a lot of time, the survey works, okay? But I always prefer an assessment. Behavior threat detection training, that is something that is critical for your security ministry, so you can prevent, so you can see this early. All of this helps you develop your physical security plan, your PSP. So it's going to outline the things that you need, right? Because you can use that PSP for obviously for protection and then for succession planning later if somebody takes over the ministry. And look, if you're looking for this, if you want individual stuff, you know that we provide both assessments, surveys. We do this behavior threat detection training. But right now we've got bundles to where you get a security survey and you get the training, the level 1 behavior threat detection training, which is the most important, all for one low price. So we have both individual pricing and bundle pricing if you want the survey with the training. So if you've got questions about predatory violence, physical security plans, the difference between a survey or assessment, or just anything, you just have a question, hey, are we doing this right? You can always get me at contact@michaelmannsecurityservice.com, or you can call me at 615-956-3912. And remember, folks, it is about prevention, not response.